The river roared against the jagged rocks 300 feet below, a constant, hungry sound. Elias stood at the very edge of the precipice, his fingers locked around the iron box pressed against his chest. 7 years of wait. 7 years of dragging his life through the dirt, all compressed into this single, heavy container. His knuckles were white, straining against the rusted metal. He tried to pivot away from the drop, but his boots caught on the loose gravel. The ground gave way. He lurched forward, the momentum of the box pulling his shoulders down toward the abyss. He slammed his knee into the mud to stop the slide, the sharp edge of the iron digging deep into his ribs. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the path. He looked down at the box, then back at the steep, unforgiving climb behind him. He knelt, his legs trembling under the strain, and set the box down in the mud. He reached for the rusted latch, his hands shaking, and prepared to open it. The latch gave way, with a sharp, metallic snap. As the lid creaked open, the wind died down, and the cliffside vanished into the haze of a memory. It was the day the factory gates locked for the final time. Elias remembered the sound of the chain hitting the iron bars. That was the start. For 7 years, he had chased work that didn't exist and wages that never arrived. He remembered the feeling of his muscles knotting from repetitive, aimless labor. He remembered the nights spent counting coins that wouldn't cover the rent, the way his hands grew calloused from tasks that led nowhere. Every rejection letter in the box was a physical blow he had absorbed over those years. He saw himself walking through the rain, his pace slowing as the hunger settled into his bones. He had spent years trying to patch together a life from the wreckage of that closure, carrying the evidence of every failure like a stone in his gut. The memory sharpened, then pulled back. He was back on the cliff. The cold air hit his face, and the weight of the box felt even more oppressive than before. He looked at the documents inside. The paper edges yellowed and brittle. They were the physical manifestation of 7 years of slow, grinding erasure. Elias pushed against the ground, trying to force his body upright. His boots skidded on the loose gravel, sending a cascade of stones tumbling into the void. He lunged for a handhold, but the iron box swung wildly, its weight dragging him back toward the edge. The metal edge bit into his ribs, a sharp, stinging pain that forced the air from his lungs. He scrambled, his fingers clawing at the dirt, but the slope was too steep and the earth too unstable. Every movement only brought him closer to the drop. He looked back up the trail, the path he had spent 7 years climbing, and saw only a blur of gray rock and fading light. The sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for him. He realized then that the weight he carried was not just iron. It was the anchor of his own exhaustion. He could not climb back. The mountain would not hold him, and his strength had finally reached its limit. He dropped to his knees, the impact jarring his entire frame. The box pinned him against the cliffside, its cold surface pressing into his chest. The river below roared. Elias pressed his knees deeper into the wet earth. The mud seeped through the fabric of his trousers, cold and thick, but he did not move. His focus narrowed until the world consisted only of the box and the rusted iron latch. He reached out with trembling fingers. The metal was pitted and rough, biting into his skin as he gripped the locking mechanism. He took a long, shuddering breath, his chest heaving. He pulled. The lock held fast, seized by years of neglect and exposure. He shifted his weight, bracing his shoulder against the cliff wall. His knuckles turned white as he applied force, his muscles straining until they burned. He felt the resistance of the metal, a stubborn barrier. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locking in a silent scream of effort. He twisted his wrist, forcing the rusted pin to rotate. A faint, grating sound rose above the roar of the river below. The metal groaned under the pressure. He pushed harder, his breath coming in bursts. With a final, violent snap, the lock gave way. He sat back on his heels, his hands hovering over the lid, waiting for the final release. Elias tilted the lid back. It creaked, a dry, metallic protest that echoed against the stone. Inside, the box was packed tight. No gold, No treasure. Only stacks of paper, yellowed and brittle at the edges. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of a legal document. He pulled it out. The ink was faded, but the words were sharp. A rejection notice from the factory board. He set it aside and pulled another, a letter, crumpled and stained, detailing a promise he had failed to keep. He kept digging. More letters, more notices, more evidence of every ambition that had withered and every bridge he had burned. He spread them across his knees, a mosaic of his own undoing. The wind caught a page, fluttering it against his cheek like a ghost. Each document was a weight he had carried in silence, a physical manifestation of his inability to move forward. He felt the heat rise in his chest. He was not a man of wealth, but a man of debts and departures. The silence of the cliffside grew heavy, pressing down on him. Ilias took a final, ragged breath. His lungs burned, but the air felt different now, thinner, colder. He did not look at the papers again. He simply opened his hands. The heavy iron box slid forward, gravity taking hold. With a sudden, violent efficiency, it tipped over the edge, the metal scraping against the dry stone of the cliffside. He watched it fall. It plummeted through the air, a dark, jagged shape against the gray backdrop of the river. It struck the rocks below with a dull, final thud that vibrated up through the soles of his boots. The impact shattered the box, scattering the contents into the spray. The documents caught the wind for a heartbeat before they were pulled down into the churning, white-capped water. They vanished beneath the surface, swept away by the relentless current. The roar of the river seemed to swallow the sound of the collision entirely. Then, the silence arrived. Elias stood up, his legs trembling as he adjusted to the sudden absence of the weight he had carried. The phantom burden was gone. Elias stood on the cliff edge for a long moment. He looked down at the water, then back at the path. He turned his body, his boots, finding purchase on the loose gravel. The first step was tentative. He shifted his weight, expecting the familiar drag of the iron box against his ribs. It did not come. He took another step, then a third. His shoulders were no longer hunched, and his spine felt straight, almost foreign in its alignment. He looked at his hands. They were empty, the skin raw and red from the metal edges he had gripped for years. He flexed his fingers, watching the knuckles move without strain. He turned fully away from the precipice and began to walk. The path back toward the valley was steep, but his pace was steady. He did not stumble. He did not reach for a handle that was no longer there. The wind pushed against his back, and he leaned into it, his stride lengthening. He looked ahead toward the distant valley, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was walking, and for the first time, he was simply walking. The trail leveled out as Elias descended into the valley floor. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. Ahead, the skeleton of the old factory rose against the deepening sky. Its broken windows stared out like empty sockets. Years ago, this place had been the anchor of his exhaustion, the site where his routine had been forged in iron and dust. He approached the rusted perimeter fence. He stopped for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the cracked concrete and the overgrown loading docks. There was no pull. The familiar tightening in his chest did not manifest. He exhaled, a long, steady sound, and continued walking. He passed the main gate, his boots crunching on the gravel where he had once stood in long, desperate lines. He did not look back at the dark, hollow halls. The first stars began to prick the twilight, cold and distant. He stepped onto the paved road, the transition from dirt to stone firm under his feet. He walked among them now, his pace matching the rhythm of the town. He was no longer a ghost of the cliffside, but a man moving through the world. Elias reached the center of the square. A wooden bench sat beneath a row of elms, their branches swaying in the evening breeze. He sat down, The wood was cool against his palms. For years, every moment in public had been a ledger of hunger, a constant tally of what he lacked and what he needed to survive. He looked at the people walking past. A merchant closed a stall. A child ran toward a doorway. He watched them move, but he did not measure their pace against his own. He did not calculate the cost of their bread or the weight of their burdens. He turned his head upward. The wind caught the canopy above, and the leaves shivered in a rhythmic, cascading motion. He tracked the movement of a single yellow leaf as it detached and spiraled toward the pavement. It landed without sound. He took a breath, deep and slow, feeling the air fill his lungs without the restriction of the iron box he had carried for so long. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for 7 years had evaporated. He remained on the bench, his hands resting flat on his knees. He was not waiting for a factory whistle. He was not bracing for a rejection. He was simply existing in the quiet space between the sunset and the night. He sat in the stillness, his stride reclaimed, his mind as steady as the earth beneath his feet.